In recent years, with the EU institutions appearing to be led more by the head than the heart, many people have begun to question the wisdom of the European project, and the fundamental importance of union has slipped out of view. There are people in this chamber whose parents lived through not just one great war, but two. When I was growing up, a dictator called Franco was still ruling with an iron fist in Spain, another dictator called Salazar in Portugal, while in Greece a bunch of colonels took over the country and totally snuffed out democracy. So the EU has been an essential force, not just in building peace, but in spreading democracy. Similarly, it's been an essential force, not just in promoting prosperity, but also equality and human rights. It was the EU which put equal pay for women firmly on the agenda, and other rights for women. The EU which prioritised the rights of people with disabilities. And that approach to human rights, to women's rights, to the rights of particular groups of people like people with disabilities or minorities, certainly in Ireland, brought many, many changes which have reflected on Irish society in the last number of decades. When the EU was at its highest standing, countries were queuing up to join. I think particularly of the situation after the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe. Now, sadly, we're looking at a situation where one member state is considering the option of leaving. I believe that would be a terrible mistake that would have consequences not just for the UK, but for Ireland and for the EU as a whole. This is a year that underscores the degree to which Ireland and the UK are intertwined. On one hand, we are commemorating 1916 and the rising that sparked the flame of independence from the British Empire. As we're speaking, I think President Higgins is in Kerry, recalling a pillar or a member of the British establishment who was executed for taking part in 1916. So we're at a unique moment in Irish history when we particularly recall the relationship that we've had down the centuries between the UK and Ireland. And we acknowledge as well that over the last 25 years, as we gradually worked towards peace in the north, relations between Ireland and the UK are closer than they've ever been. So when we broach the issue of Brexit, we don't do so in an attempt to interfere in the decision of a sovereign state. We do so because our economies and societies and histories and the fates of our people are intertwined, and the UK's decision will have implications for Ireland. That's why I suggested to the Taoiseach that we should hold this debate today as a matter of priority, because the referendum is drawing nearer and we must be ready, come what may. In 9 weeks' time, little more than the short period in which we've been all teasing out government formation, the people of the UK will go to the polls on this vital issue. The government's position is clear and has been for some time. We want the UK as our friend, our closest neighbour and partner, to remain a member of a reformed EU. The word reformed is important in this context. As a social democrat, As someone who believes that the single best protection against poverty is secure and fairly paid work, I must say I was appalled by the EU's initial response to the financial crisis. Too slow, dictated from the centre, and ideologically blinkered in approach. As a minister from 2011, I argued, along with my colleagues in the Labour Party, repeatedly that the EU needed to shift from austerity towards a policy based on investment, growth and job creation, with full employment the central target. I pressed the case for that shift at European level at every opportunity, something I continued to do when I became Tánaiste and Labour Party leader. And thankfully, the EU's approach did change, even if the pace of change has been frustratingly slow. From the EU-wide youth guarantee to help young people find work, to find training and education, to the ECB's attempt to boost Member States' economy, the EU has finally got on to a better track. I mention this because it's perfectly legitimate for European citizens to have questions, to have doubts, to have disappointments about the EU. But I still fundamentally believe that all Member States, including Ireland, including the UK, are stronger within. And the task we face is to restore the great solidarity that underpinned the European ideal, because that solidarity will be essential if we are to tackle today's global challenges. Going it alone is not really an option when you're talking about climate change, when you're talking about terrorism and all of the other myriad of challenges that face different societies and countries today. We're stronger working together than going our separate ways, because there are so many problems we are better facing together rather than alone. The migration crisis is the latest tragic demonstration of that. The same can be said for terrorism, with the horrors of the attacks in Belgium and France to the forefront of our minds. No single member state can confront that spectre alone. Energy security, climate change, and a world economy that recognises no borders are just some of the others. So we want the UK to remain because, as a general principle, we are stronger working together in a globalised world. But there are also three specific reasons why we want the UK to stay. The first is the economy. More than 1 billion of goods and services are traded every week between the UK and Ireland. Anything that might get in the way of seamless flows of goods, services, capital and people between our two countries is not welcome. The second is the North. The EU has been an important factor in sustaining peace and prosperity in Northern Ireland. John Hume, as the leading architect of the peace process, was, I think, the first person to recognise that and seek to intrinsically involve the EU as a guarantor and friend of the peace process. Much needed funding, including through programmes like Peace and Interreg, will provide almost $3 billion in the 6 years to 2020. North-South cooperation is much easier when both jurisdictions are members of the same union. And when, I can't remember when we last had border posts. They're gone. Who would want to see any semblance or reference to them returning? The third relates to the EU institutions themselves. The UK is an important, influential voice at the table in Brussels. We are allies on many of the key issues facing the EU. The withdrawal of the UK would weaken the Union, both in substance and reputation, at a time of serious challenges. Should the UK vote to leave, we would enter uncharted waters, a period of instability that could be enormously damaging to Ireland at a time when we've just begun to get back on our feet. That is why it's crucially important that there's a clear understanding of the issues. Irrespective of the outcome of the UK referendum, Ireland, as a competitive, diversified and global economy, will remain a committed member of the EU and a full member of the Eurozone. As a small, open economy, we value our access to a single market of over 500 million people. But we also recognise that the project has been tarnished and lost traction in recent decades, and we must tackle this problem. The European model worked extremely well for much of the first 50 years, when member states developed a rough consensus about how to address economic and social issues. Many of the solutions put in place were those advocated by parties like the Labour Party, parties of the centre-left, the welfare state, public health services, workers' rights, women's emancipation and social dialogue. There truly was a social Europe. In recent years, leading up to and after the financial crisis, policy shifted to the right. The consensus weakened, progress stalled, and we haven't faced today's great challenges with the vigour or sense of fairness that Europe tackled them in the past. The only way to do that is by working together to restore the social Europe to the benefit of all our people. Jean Monnet said, "Beyond people's differences and geographical boundaries, there lies a common interest." And for people who are Irish citizens living in the UK, obviously the proposed referendum poses really challenging issues. But as people return home, as people holiday here, I think there should be a clear message that whether they living in Britain and we here back home in Ireland, that certainly Irish society has benefited enormously from our involvement in the EU. If you look back at the history of our entry into the EU, it was before we actually successfully negotiated. There were a series of studies led by the OECD, which said if Ireland was to prosper as a country and develop investment and industry, we had to, as a country, invest in education so that people could get employment. And that, in fact, became one of the reasons the social agreement in Ireland to invest in education, to invest in opportunity so that people could get employment and build businesses. Not only did that help to grow the EU, but obviously it had enormous dividends for us here in Ireland and for a lot of people in the UK. So I wish people in the UK well during this debate. And to say that we respect absolutely citizens' rights to vote as they decide what is best for them and for the United Kingdom. But to say particularly to people with links to Ireland that we feel that we've done well out of this and we would like to see our friend, our neighbour and our trading partner stay with the EU, reform it as necessary, let's have that debate. But in a globalised world, we need to work together and not separate apart.